Hi there, and welcome to another live episode of the webinar series. Back into the very cold Amsterdam. I've got my wake up light thing going on because we don't have a lot of light in my apartment. And I should turn this off soon, by the way, otherwise, I'm not able to sleep tonight. Had a lot of very good questions this week, so let's get right to it. I'm gonna switch to the shared screen setup. Let's have a look. Let's start the slideshow from the beginning, and then I'm going to share my screen. 1 second, application window. And there we go. Okay, lots of great questions. Like I said, let's get to them and tackle them one by one. First question is about training. Many people, mostly women, at my gym use bands on their knees when they're doing squats and hip thrusts. Would you talk about your feelings on this? Yeah, very interesting topic because I've actually conducted my own research because I was not happy with how much research that had been done in the scientific literature. So I went ahead and I went with my friend and colleague Nick. Well, colleague, he is a study mate of mine, and Nick and I went out to do some EMG testing. Only one person, so we didn't have. It was not like a typical study with 20 participants, but at least we had some results, some very clear results. First off, there's also been research by Foley et al. In 2017 showing that there was some increased glute activity when people were using the mini bands. These are getting marketed like crazy by some people on Instagram, by the way. So there's a lot of financial interest going on there. But it showed a clear increase for beginners. But when experienced trainees were using very high weights, like 150 pounds plus for females, then it was quite questionable whether it was actually increasing the glute activity because in a way, the glutes were already maximally active with the higher weights and their increased experience of using the squatting technique. However, we did some personal research, like I said, Nick and I, and we found that using the mini bands on a low bar squat with 120 kilograms, this is like freaky Dutch, you don't have to mind this, just watch these figures. We saw a 49.9% of the maximum activity of the glutes going on in those 9 reps. So that's more than what we saw the low bar squat. Let's see, this was, I think this was the low bar squat. It should say low bar squat, not high bar. Very sorry about that one. We only saw 40%. Then in a high bar squat, we saw 36.6%. And then in the low bar squat, combined with resistance bands, like vertical bands, not mini bands, but resistance band, we only saw 40.8, so a slight increase. But for the glutes, we saw with the mini bands a lot more. So there may be something to it, but I cannot be sure on that. More research needs to be done. In the process of writing an article on this, it should be by you somewhere in 2019, because I'm writing a lot of articles right now, doing a lot of calculators, a lot of tools, so that takes a lot of my time. I hope to finish this in this year at least, so stay tuned. Great question. Next one. Another big one is people squatting with their feet on plates to increase stability or make the movement more quad dominant. Their feet on plates, I'm assuming you mean their heels on like a plate, like their heels get higher. Yeah, they actually did some great research on that. Edwards et al. In 2008 This also goes for squatting shoes or any type of weightlifting shoes that increase the distance from your heel to the floor. What happens in this case is you can maintain a more upright posture. Doesn't matter whether you're doing low bar or high bar squatting, you can maintain a more upright posture when you elevate your heels. What it's also going to do is it's going to increase the knee moment arm, which is a fancy term for saying that the bar path, the distance between the bar path and the knee joint is going to increase, which is going to increase the moment going around. And the moment is force times distance. So that's going to increase when you have your heels elevated compared to having them on the ground, which will increase the hip moment arm. So they also showed that indeed the muscle activity in the vastus medialis and vastus lateralis, which are two of the quad muscles, it increased if they increase the heel height. Like you can see here, 5 centimeters increase the vastus medialis, which is like the teardrop muscle in your quads. It increased from 84% to 102% of the maximum isometric activity, and it can be higher than 102 because it's actually a dynamic contraction instead of an isometric contraction. The only thing that matters is it was higher, and also for the lateral part of the quad. So actually, yeah, it does make the movement more quad dominant, according to this research by Edwards. More stable? I don't really get what you mean by that. I would say, yeah, squatting shoes help because they have flat soles, so they make you more stable in general, especially compared to squatting on a Swiss ball or squatting on running shoes. So definitely advocate that. But no, I wouldn't say this heel elevation specifically adds any more stability. So that's my question to that. Next question. That's my answer to that. Sorry. Next question. So how do you feel about time under tension techniques such as isometric squeezing or holds at various points of the range of motion during things like curls or when people hold the very top of dumbbell lateral raises for a couple seconds? It seems counterproductive, but is there ever a time for this? Yeah, it seems counterproductive, and I mostly agree with that. Not sure if there's ever a time for this. Could be, but how you should see it is you have a certain time under tension during a set of an exercise. And when you're actually holding it like that, especially in lateral raises, you're actually wasting that time under tension on an isometric hold. While you could be spending that time under tension, you dynamically moving your muscle while it's under tension. And this is the most important factor to stimulate growth. So to put it into a formula, stimulus for growth is time under tension, which is mechanical tension basically, times the length difference of the muscle. So if you're just holding a dumbbell during a dumbbell curl and you're not moving it, then there's a lot of time under tension, but there's no length difference in muscle, so it's not going to stimulate a lot of growth. However, if you're moving the muscle through its entire range of motion, there's going to be a lot more stimulus for growth. So that's what you should keep in mind. And if you only, for example, if you only have a budget of 30 seconds of time under tension, you want to cross as much muscle length as possible in those 30 seconds to make the set as productive as possible. And this is why range of motion is so important. This is why it's not just time under tension, because if this were the case, you could just hold any exercise for 30 seconds, but you want to bring the muscle through its full length and through its shortest length to make sure that it crosses the whole length of the muscle while it's being while it's under that tension, while it's under that mechanical tension. So that's the biggest factor for stimulating muscle to grow. So that's how you should view it. And I don't see how these techniques, they look cool, but they don't, from what I know, they aren't going to add anything. And also research has not shown this as far as I know. All right, great question. Next one. Is there a valuable reason to pre-exhaust some of the muscles that helps in an exercise when muscle growth is the main target for training? For example, doing leg extensions or curls just before a hip thrust. Great question. I love this question. It's not very much research, actually. And I had some discussions about this with Menno Henselmans as well, who knows a lot about this topic too. I mean, not too, but he knows a lot about this topic. But to my knowledge, there are no studies that looked directly at muscle hypertrophy in this context. However, there's been research by Soares et al. That looked at muscle activity specifically. So what they did is they performed a triceps push down just before the bench press. And because you're also using your the triceps in the bench press, you could hypothesize that you have to use more of your chest to compensate for the fact that the triceps are fatigued as hell and they cannot help in the movement. So this is the hypothesis, and indeed what they saw is compared to a traditional set with about 80% 1 rep max, they saw this is the muscle activity. They saw that in the last repetition of the set, the pre-exhaustion of the triceps pushdown caused more chest activity. So they started at the same chest activity at the first rep, a little bit more, as you can see, for the pre-exhaustion condition. But at the last repetition, especially when probably the triceps were fully drained, the chest really had to compensate for that triceps. And there was a distinct difference in activation. So from that perspective, maybe that could have also led to more hypertrophy because there was more overall activity in the chest. So next slide, I'm going to show you why I think this is true. Because BFR, which is blood flow restriction training, has been shown actually that it can increase chest gains. Yasuda et al. In 2010. By increasing chest activity, which is shown by other research, which I'm not citing here. But what they showed actually, the gains after 2 weeks in this Yasuda study, they were bigger when BFRs, basically they had like these bands just below their armpits, which made sure that the triceps they could not help as much because the triceps were deprived oxygen. So it's kind of like the same circumstance as we talked about before. So basically the triceps could not help as much in the bench press. And there they actually saw that the change in muscle thickness, MTH, was bigger. This is like the controlled, which was traditional training. I think this was traditional training. You have to get me back on that. It's a non-blood flow restriction. I cannot really believe actually that they had no thickness increases. So actually I'm going to revert from this study and not talk about it. I'm sorry on my part. So this is actually compared to, I think, a controlled non-blood flow restriction group who was on 30% 1 rep max probably, and this one was also on 30% 1 rep max, and they had a specific increase in chest growth, but they did not show the comparison to doing just a traditional set, right, of like 80% 1 rep max. So I have to get back on that and maybe get back to you soon by looking at the study more in detail. But what I can tell you that Lumica et al. Did a big review on the studies, like 6 studies that actually researched this, and they showed that indeed the chest had more growth when you shut down the triceps by blood flow restriction. So in that sense, this could hypothetically also lead to more muscle growth, and also in different exercises like the hip thrust. So very good point. it may be a viable training technique, but we cannot be certain until there's more research. So, great question. Next one. What are the main differences in muscle activation, if any, between the two machines, lying leg curl and sitting leg curl? Well, the muscle activation is quite similar, but as we saw earlier, it depends on which part of the muscle length this muscle activity or time under tension is actually active. So as you can see from this image, this is from a previous webinar I did. When you're seated, your hip angle is actually like this, almost 90 degrees. But when you are indeed lying, then the hip angle is a little bit different. When you are actually lying on the ground, you can actually reach the shortest possible hamstring length that's possible, if that makes sense. Because the hamstrings crosses the hip and also the knee joint. And when you're in this position, it's at its shortest possible length. And when you're, for example, when you're in the Romanian deadlift position, when your torso is parallel, then the hamstring is actually in its longest position. Anyways, this is the main difference. So if you're combining the Romanian deadlift with a leg curl variation, I would always say go with the lying leg curl variation instead of the seated one. Why? Because with the Romanian deadlift, you're targeting the longest muscle lengths. And with the lying leg curl, you actually get to stimulate the muscle at the shortest muscle lengths, if that makes sense. If not, just let me know in a comment. I'll get back to it in another comment or another webinar. So I hope that makes sense. With the lying leg curl, you can, or with the Swiss ball leg curl, you can actually stimulate the hamstrings at the shortest length that it can get to. So that's why I would prefer that over the seated leg curl when you're combining it with the Romanian deadlift. Great question. Let's get to the next one. When doing flies in a pec deck machine and you have the option to choose the grip, either neutral or pronated, so pronated meaning that it becomes like the grip you have on Bayesian flies, what grip do you recommend and what is the main difference? Great question. Talked about this with Menno Henselmans, who basically invented the Bayesian fly exercise as well this morning. Just to explain the difference, when you have your hand like this, your shoulder is internally rotated, IR. And this is what's happening when you're using a pronated grip, like in the Bayesian flies. And what this does is it will cause more front delt activity. Why? Because when you're bending your arm like this, instead of bending it like this in the bottom position, so this guy would be smacking someone in the head that's next to him, basically by externally rotating his shoulder. And in that position, the front deltoid is not in a great position to use force on the humerus, on this bone. So putting it in this position, in the Bayesian fly position, actually helps the front delt to activate more. So that's why it also shows more activity. So this is also true for the pectoralis. Why? As you can see, the pectoralis, the chest muscle, is actually attached to the side of the humerus. So if you're pronating, if you're internally rotating your shoulder like this guy is doing, then the line of pull on the bone will be in a more advantageous position for the chest muscle. And that's why the chest can probably produce more force and can probably also be activated more. But this is a hypothesis because there's no actual research that has investigated this. So this is a big hypothesis, but it's very possible. But if you actually want to isolate the chest muscle, then it's probably better to do the traditional neutral grip pec deck, which is also like the neutral grip fly that you see any bro or any normal person that's not like patient educated do in the gym, like with the handles, right? So that way you can probably isolate the chest muscle more. However, the chest muscle probably doesn't have as high of an activity as in this pronated grip. So that's the main difference. So I recommend, if you want to stimulate the chest and the front delt maximally, to use the pronated grip. Probably you will also be a little bit stronger with that grip because, for example, it's also the grip that you use in a bench press or whatever. Hope that helps. Next topic, injuries. A client of mine has epicondylitis medialis, meaning that's a very scientific term for golfer's elbow, which means that there's a tendinitis, so inflammation, chronic inflammation in the tendon of the lower arm muscle over here at the inside of the elbow, not the outside. That's like tennis elbow. It's the inside, the medial side of the elbow that's closest to your body. Since 6 months, therapy is stretching, cooling, and some massage around the elbow. I would not specifically agree with this. There's not a lot of, well, yeah, there's some research that it helps, but in a sense, the most important things are, I think, active recovery and still continuing to train, strengthening the muscles while limiting stress on the tendon. So you can stress the muscle and you can stress the tendon. And the proportion of a muscle to tendon stress is called tissue stress distribution. So I also explained this here: muscle versus tendon or connective tissue stress. It's worst when you're actually in a bar path that you cannot really control, as in the Smith machine. It's best when your joints have the possibility to move freely, such as in the TRX, for example. That's the perfect, doing a push-up in a TRX. Your hands and your elbows can move freely, so that way the stress on the tendons is a lot less and the stress on the muscles is more. So that's the situation you want to get in, and that's also what I advise when you're trying to train while you have golfer's elbow. Other than that, just getting back to it, just nutrition-wise, omega-3, I would advise like maybe 1 to 3 grams per day, not 2 to 3, which can be big on your, like it can be a drain on your budget because omega-3 fatty acids are quite expensive, especially if you have a good brand. These will lower chronic inflammation in general, which can help. But exercise-wise, you want more freedom in your elbow to reduce this connective tissue strain. So, for example, what can help is rotary handles, as is the case in TRX push-ups. And you can also use dumbbells instead of barbells, which is also going to increase the freedom you have in your elbows. And then cables are even better than dumbbells because you don't need to stabilize the cables. You do need to stabilize the dumbbells, which is thought to be more stressful for the tendons as well. So cabled chest press is really great for this condition. And then if you want to do those, do them higher reps and lower tempo. So you're specifically stressing the muscle a lot, bringing some blood flow to the area so that active recovery is better in that area. Make sure that there's no pain going on there. That's the biggest indicator. You don't want any pain there. And you also want to avoid any lockout positions. So any exercises, you want to avoid the lockout position because that's when the stress on the elbows seems to be highest, especially on the medial, on the inner side of the elbow. So try to avoid that. All right, next topic, sleep, stress, and especially this one, miscellaneous. So any topics? Let's get to the questions. I'm interested in what is the best intensity for endurance sports when the focus is on running and not on hypertrophy. Type 1 muscle fiber preferred then, right? Not type 2. Yeah, type 2 is the fast twitch muscle fiber type. Type 1 is the slow twitch, which is a more endurance type. But I would say that is not the main thing you're going after with endurance training. You actually want to improve your cardiovascular conditioning. That's number one, not specifically the distribution of type 1 and type 2. Of course, that will change probably because you're doing more endurance training, but that's not the main goal. And how can you measure cardiovascular conditioning? You can measure this by your VO2 max, which is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use per kilogram of body weight per minute. Mostly it's measured in liters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So that's the main measure you want to look for. And also you got to watch that if you're doing any type of endurance training, it's going to deplete your glycogen, especially on higher intensities, a lot more than weight training. And if you're interested in this topic, look at Alex Fiata. He's like really into combining conditioning exercise with weight training so that you get the best of both worlds. So definitely look at completehumanperformance.com. I will include this PowerPoint presentation with all the links to the post on Patreon that concerns this this webinar. So what's the best intensity then, right? So I had a look, another look at the research. What does the research say? Well, there's a big ass study by Scribbins et al. In 2016, pretty recent. Basically, he's taken together about 20 plus studies in cycling, running, soccer, that looked at intensity. I'm not sure on the soccer one, by the way, but mostly cycling and running. I have to have another look at that. But mostly they were looking at running and cycling, and they looked at different training intensities, but also training volumes and also session doses, which is a combination of training intensity and volume, etc. And this beta, this little sign, this is a Greek sign which means how much can it predict changes in VO2 max, which is basically this when you're measuring bench press strength for strength training. This is like what you're measuring, like I just explained, when you're measuring cardiovascular conditioning. And they concluded that VO2 max were unaffected by exercise training intensity. So over all these studies, there was not a main effect of training intensity, which is strange because you would think this is the case. But the thing is, they only looked at studies with at least 60% of VO2 max. And if you want to get an idea of what this is, how intense this is, you can actually convert this to a heart rate maximum. So there's a calculator I include here. It's linked here. So that's from 60% to 92% of your VO2 max is about between 145 to 185 beeps per minute for a 30-year-old man. So that's about the intensities that they studied. So starting from 145 beats per minute, there doesn't seem to be more benefit of going up in intensity according to these studies, because there was like almost no correlation between training intensity and then the outcome measure, your conditioning VO2 max. It didn't change more from training at a higher intensity. So as long as you're above that threshold, then you should be golden. Training volume also didn't show any benefit, but I think we have to look more specifically at the type of people that participated in all the studies that this big meta-analysis looked at. And I don't want to say too much about that, but probably any intensity above that one is great for building up endurance. All right, next question is about the program designer that I just released a couple weeks ago. I'm releasing it to people that are signing up to the Patreon page within 24 hours of certain moments. And I'm also going to be putting it up for a set amount, for a set fee, an amount of money very soon. I'm just cleaning it up right now. So the question was, can you discuss activation and counting volume for the lateral deltoids during press and fly movements for the pecs? Specifically, why you count Bayesian fly as 0.5 for the lateral delt? Great question, and this comes down to what I was explaining in the previous slide. So if you want to compare the Bayesian fly to a typical fly, you will look at internally or externally rotated shoulders. So let's just look at the anatomy of the side of the deltoid. So I'm just going to go back to that slide and show you. So point 2 is the lateral deltoid, right? So if this guy is holding his arm like this, as in the Bayesian fly, probably this muscle can help a little bit with a flying movement. But if this guy is actually externally rotating his arm like this guy is doing in the bottom part, then the lateral deltoid is not in a position to help the fly movement. And that's the main difference. So the more pronated or the more internally rotated the arm is, the more the lateral deltoid can help in a fly movement. And that's why the Bayesian fly is counting the lateral deltoid to help about 50% or 0.5 compared to 0 in the regular fly, if that makes sense. All right, next question. Also about the program designer, can you discuss muscle activation and counting volume for lat prayers, which is this exercise, which is basically an isolation exercise for the lateral, for the latissimus dorsi, the wing muscle. You don't count them at all for the mid or lower traps. Is there not some degree of scapular depression and retraction? Definitely, there is some degree of scapular depression and retraction. But what you have to realize is that the sets per week per muscle, as shown here, so 10 sets per week per muscle, they are actually what you're actually measuring is like how many sets can your chest possibly recover from successfully per week. For beginners, for example, it is shown to be around 10 sets per week. But as we've seen before, when you're actually moving a muscle through its full range of motion length, you're actually damaging and stimulating it much more than keeping it in an isometric, in a non-moving contraction, as is the case in scapular depression and retraction in this exercise. So actually, you're not using up much muscle recovery capacity when you're just tensing the muscle without actually moving the muscle. And that's why I didn't count them at all in this movement. So yeah, you're contracting that muscle, but it's not lengthening or shortening much during the exercise. And therefore, you don't need a lot of recovery capacity to heal the muscle, because there's not a lot of damage going on. There's not a lot of stimulation going on. So that's why I'm not counting it towards that 10 sets per week that you can successfully recover from. I hope that makes a little bit sense. Yeah. Next one. I noticed you only count upper traps as 0.5, which is 50%. So basically, if you're doing one set of lateral raises, then that counts as 0.5 sets towards the recovery capacity of the upper traps, explained in those terms as before. So I know that you only count those as 0.5 for lateral raises and not only count as 0.5 lateral raises. Is there a reason only count? Okay, basically this question is inferring that it should be more, right? So what I thought is that the question was asking, like, why am I even counting them? Well, you're actually using them a little bit. Most people, because as you can see here, the shoulder blades are rotated upwards a little bit at the top position of the lateral raise. So actually your upper traps are actually going through a movement a little bit, and they're also being activated. So probably they also need some recovery capacity to heal from that. And that's why I'm counting 0.5 sets to upper traps and not like the full sets, because you can actually actively push your shoulder blades down to make sure that there's minimal involvement of the upper traps. And if you compare to like dumbbell shrugs with like 100 pounds in each of your hands, then this is nothing compared to that. So that's why it's not 1, but it's 0.5. So that's the reasoning, so to say, behind that. And there's also some scientific studies and also a personal experiment by Brad Contreras that shows these type of figures. So that's why I went with 0.5. Also, is there a reason why you count standing overhead press as 0.5 for the mid and lower traps? Standing overhead dumbbell press is 0. No, not a very good reason. I went back to look at that, and my partner also went back to look at that, and we discovered that this is an error, and we deleted it in the newly updated version, and I will send it soon to everyone that already has the other version of the program designer to make sure that you have the correct version now. I'm very sorry about that, but it's bound to happen when you're creating a product like that. So yeah, good call on that one. Good research skills. Let me know if you find anything else. Those were the questions for this week. Hope it was valuable. If you have any feedback, let me know in the comments below, and make sure to ask your newer questions in the next webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. I appreciate you all for being here. I appreciate your attention. And yeah, let's make next week a good one. Thanks.